Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Sono Andrew Tootell. He's an Australian Zen teacher in the Ordinary Mind Zen School. He is the dharma heir of Barry Magid and is an accredited mental health social worker and maintains a private psychotherapy practice. How you doing today, Andrew?
Very well, thank you, Barry. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us. And what's the name of your sangha or practice group in Australia?
Yes, when I originally started the sangha back in 2015, we just went by the name Ordinary Mind Zen Mid-North Coast, which is where I live in Australia. So that's kind of like halfway between Sydney and Brisbane.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, it's an interesting area because it was part of the escape from the country by the alternative seeking people in the 70s. And there's a number of communes that were established up here. And hence, there's always been a fertile ground or field for dharma practice. A few years ago, as the sangha grew a little bit and matured a little bit, and we developed a constitution, we had a vote on the name, and it wasn't my choice, but the sangha, the majority was to change the name to OzZen. That's OZZEN, which was fine by me because I like the play on Oz and home. So
you were doing this in appreciation for the Oz TV show on HBO, right?
I don't know what that is. No.
Oh, it's an old prison show on HBO. Yeah. Oz.
Yeah.
Horrible joke. Sorry. And so, can you tell me a little bit about the Zen Center? It's all lay practitioners, of course, right?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a house which we rent as a Zen center. So we basically have always rented what we call here in Australia it's kind of like a Country Women's Association, the CWA hall. They have them all over around Australia, and it's a beautiful hall with a kitchen and a couple of rooms, and we rent that for when we meet together, and at other times we connect a lot by Zoom, and like so many Zen groups, and during COVID, our sangha expanded a little bit to go to people who are not local. So there's a number of active members who don't live locally. So we've continued that. Yeah.
What's the area like? Is it suburban? Is it more? Is there a city? What?
Yeah, it's where I live at the moment, called Coffs Harbour, as the name implies, is a harbour, and it's on the coast, and it's a regional city, so population of about, I'm not quite sure what it is these days, maybe 100, 120,000. And then just like half an hour inland in a little valley is a town called Bellingen, which is where I lived with my wife for about 13 years before moving to Coffs Harbour. That's a beautiful little town on a river in a valley. And
is it kind of a resort area a little bit?
It is a bit of a holiday destination for people, yeah. And a tree changing destination. So it's a beautiful area, and then you've got the coast with the beautiful beaches, and then as you look back, you've got the mountains, the hinterland, and in the hinterland's probably one of the around this area one of the largest subtropical rainforests in the world. So there's a lot of activism around trying to save the forest from logging here, and a number of our sangha members are actively involved in that.
So subtropical, you don't get kind of continental type weather. It stays fairly mild or warm year round.
It's a lovely climate apart from maybe in our peak summer. So for January and February, can get quite hot and humid. Especially in Bellingen in the valley. It's on the coast, it's a little bit better to get the sea breezes.
Great. So you grew up in Australia, I presume?
No, you might detect every now and again the accent that I covered over. Grew up in Lancashire, England, not far
Okay.
from Manchester.
I'm horrible. I can't tell English versus South African versus Australian. I mean,
Yeah,
if they're all next to each other, I can, but if I just meet someone like at the airport or something, I couldn't tell you the accent to save my life.
yeah. So that was like growing up in a sort of like industrial town, but with like in England, there's lots of green in between the towns still. But yeah, primarily my family comes from that sort of cotton industry in Manchester
Work, working
and
class.
working class. And mum and my sister was the first to come to Australia in 1967.
Mhm.
She got married fairly young and came here, and then my mum and dad followed in 1969,
Mhm.
November 1969, and I just turned 13 years old, just come into puberty a year or two before, and was very excited about coming to Australia, and it was a wonderful. In those days, they were called the 10-pound poms. Um, the Australian government had this agreement with the English government that you could apply to come to Australia, pay £10, and you could come on an ocean liner, 5 or 6 weeks on the ocean, and you had entered into a contract to stay here for at least 2 years. If you
Really?
went back before the 2 years, you had to pay the money back. Of course, a lot of migrants would come, get very homesick, which was the case, I think, for my father. But for me, the actual journey was kind of like transformative, an archetypal kind of journey.
You spent a month on a ship?
On a ship, yeah,
Wow.
and seeing dolphins and flying fish, and then arriving in this country and coming to. We finally arrived in Sydney, and my father had a job in a place called Wollongong, which is about an hour and a half down the coast from Sydney,
Hmm.
and we settled there. And again, similar to here, lovely beaches, beautiful mountains in the background. I mean, there was a big industrial sort of steelworks in Wollongong in those days, but compared to where I grew up, it was where the holiday would be to drive from the little town where I lived near Manchester to Blackpool, which was a little resort on the seaside. To come here was pretty amazing.
Hmm. What motivated the move by your parents, do you think?
I think for my parents, like many migrants, it was just the uprooting from the traditional ways of being, the family. My father was a very, loved his. He grew up playing cricket and soccer, and as you get older, you progress to lawn bowls. And he was a veteran from the army, Second World War, and I think for him it was a difficult transition. And yeah.
Was it was it largely economically motivated or just a new start kind of psychologically, do you think?
I think it was primarily motivated, and I could be wrong, but I think it was primarily motivated by my mum. My sister had her first child, and I think mum just wanted to be with her daughter and her grandchild,
Mhm.
and I think dad just would went along with that.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't dad's idea, I don't think.
Yeah. Mhm. Was that a huge culture shock for you going from UK to Australia?
It was a culture shock in a positive way,
Mhm.
um, because growing up in England, where I grew up, it was a fairly kind of like a rough area to a certain extent. So,
Mhm.
primary school could be fairly combative, and you had to stand up and fight. And so I was able to do that. But I remember I mean, I had a fairly idealistic childhood in many ways because as a child, of course, which sort of fits with Zen in a way, what you experience is your imagination transforms the area where you live, where abandoned factories become places of exploration and adventures, and sort of playing fields covered with snow become the Antarctic. And so as a child, and we had used to have this in England that's called Bonfire Night on November the 5th, where you would celebrating Guy Fawkes and the terrorist who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament. And you gather wood and build this big bonfire, and you have a gang, and then and you go around singing to collect money to buy fireworks, and then all the little neighborhood would come and celebrate around the bonfire, and you'd roast potatoes and eat treacle toffee and set off the fireworks, and then of course Christmas. Those kind of that November leading into December and Christmas and the snow were quite magical in some ways. Mm-hmm. But then when I became an adolescent, I started to see some of the ugliness of the environment as well. And so when Mum and Dad decided to come, I was quite happy. And I just started to read, and I was just starting to read Tom Sawyer, and I was getting into the novels. And so I was full of adventure. So, and then coming to Australia, the high school, even though it was it wasn't like in England. You have this thing called in those days it was called the 11 plus. When you were 11 years old, you sat an IQ test, and that determined whether or not you went to grammar school, which was for the university people, or to what they call the secondary school or comprehensive school, where people would go to the trades or. Mm-hmm. So I didn't get into grammar school, so I never had an image of myself as being academic. And then coming to England, to Australia, we had a chat with the school principal. I'd done first year high school in England. When I came to Australia, he suggested I repeat, and it was probably a very good move. So I repeated first year high school in Australia. I was a year older than my peers. Mm-hmm. But I surprised myself and did really well academically in that first year. So that sort of, and I started wearing glasses for the first time. It was interesting because short-sighted, it started to become apparent when I was about, 10 years old or something. I couldn't see the blackboard and had to start wearing glasses, which was a huge little tea trauma for me at that time, to have to wear glasses. And so when I came to Australia, I transitioned to wearing my glasses full time as well. So maybe that fitted with the academic Andrew coming out. I still played sports, still played soccer and cricket, but
were you fairly athletic?
Less importance, and the academic thing became more important as I grew older in Australia.
Were you fairly athletic?
Yes, yeah. I used to love soccer, cricket, and long distance running, and also the 1500 meters.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up in any sort of religious context? Were your parents religious? Did you go to church?
Just nominally Church of England. So it was just like marriages and funerals. And so I didn't attend, I don't think I even attended Sunday school. But I do remember first year high school, they had religious classes. And so I was a little bit interested.
This is in England?
In England, yeah. I was a bit interested in that. And I also remember, again, I can't remember my exact age, maybe 10 years old. And in those days, of course, we used to have bubble gum. You collect bubble gum, the cards in bubble gum packets in England. And often they were just cards of soccer players, but they had this particular series of this Martian invasion. They were pretty good little cards that you collected, but they were a bit scary. And
I'm shocked you called it soccer.
Soccer, yeah.
Is it called soccer in England?
They call it football. It's football. I mean,
okay. You're just being kind to us Americans.
Soccer is what it's called in Australia.
Yeah. It is. Okay.
Because we have, unfortunately, we have a number of footballs in Australia. Not only do we have soccer, but we have rugby union, we have rugby league, and we also have this native game, called Australian Rules, AFL. which is probably the most popular football in Australia. So soccer's a little bit down the hierarchy, unfortunately. But anyway, so I used to get this. I started to get these kind of like little panicky kind of attacks at night time. I used to have this. Oh, what if I stop breathing? And then I'd have sort of like this struggle with my breath. And one day I was walking along the street, and I picked up this little crucifix and I put it under my pillow, and it seemed to do the trick in some way. Because I mean, again, at that age of 10, you can sometimes look up at this, you know, those questions of, you know, where does all this come from? Where did I come from? What is all this kind of thing? I remember that.
Yeah. And would you say, I'm getting my internet connection.
Just one more thing, just one more memory too. I do remember my mum sometimes at nighttime doing the Lord's Prayer, and I kind of like that as well. And so my mum's mother was very religious. She was a Methodist, pretty strict. I was never very close to my maternal grandmother, and my mum never knew her father because he was actually locked up in the lunatic asylum somewhere in Bolton when she was very young, and she never ever saw him. Really tragic. And but yeah, so they were the only kind of like religious elements of my primary school growing up in England years. Yeah.
So it just was kind of almost a non-issue for you, largely.
What was a non-issue?
Religion, which is kind of a non-issue, largely.
I wouldn't say that. It was kind of there in the background in some ways. Of course, Christmas was a wonderful celebration and magical. Just to enjoy the carols and all that kind of stuff. I do remember.
I live near an airport.
At a very young age in Australia, so maybe around the age of 15, 16, going along to an evangelical. I met this guy. I was doing some school holiday work at the steelworks, and met this guy who used to read the Bible all the time, and he was a member of something like those evangelical churches where you speak in tongues. And so I went along to one of those meetings and spoke in tongues and asked God to give me my eyesight back, and unfortunately he didn't. So it was a short romance with Christianity at that point in time.
Is Australia a fairly secular culture? Maybe contrast it to England, which is fairly secular.
A lot more secular than the United States. So, for example, we can have one of the most famous prime ministers in my time was a guy called Bob Hawke, who was openly, maybe not atheist, but certainly agnostic. And so we can have prime ministers here who don't identify as Christian. Yeah.
Yeah. Where in America, you at least have to fake it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And when I was in the States, I there was a much more like sometimes I'd go in a cafe and there'd be a Bible studies group meeting. It was more prevalent in your culture. Yeah.
Would you say as a teenager you were happy? I mean, were you gregarious? Were you serious? Were you shy?
Shy was a word that sticks out, but happy. I think I was relatively happy. My childhood certainly, loving, warm home. My sister was, I don't know, she's about 8 years older than me, was like a second mother. I have a brother, but he'd left home before I really knew him. So he was a war baby, never knew his father for about 5 or 6 years while Dad was in the war.
Wow.
So close to my mum, and so it was a very loving home. Coming into adolescence when I was about like 16, 17, going through this There was that sort of shyness element to it, like, in terms of asking a girl to dance, or the shyness around, dating girls was present. And I always fairly comfortable in boys groups. So because of my sporting abilities and that was always fairly comfortable for me.
Are you fairly
And,
tall?
hey,
Are you fairly tall?
yeah, almost 6 foot, 5 foot 11 and a half. That was an advantage, yeah, as a boy. And but roundabout, I don't know, because I think, see, I wasn't aware of it, but at the time when my father was going through a major sort of mental health crisis in Australia, which I wasn't totally aware of, but I was probably picking it up subliminally. And there was a crisis in the family, which I wasn't aware of, but I was probably picking it up subliminally.
Mm-hmm.
And then around about the age of 16, 17, starting to get into all the literature and philosophy and existentialism and all Bob Dylan and all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't say I was depressed. I don't think I was clinically depressed, but I remember mum and dad paying for me to see a psychiatrist, and me and the psychiatrist ended up chatting about existentialism and stuff, and it was quite enjoyable. So it was more that kind of adolescent angst rather than a clinical depression. I don't think I was clinically depressed. And there was a lot of highs in it as well, like falling in love for the first time, and just the joy of being an adolescent, being alive, and discovering music and all that kind of stuff. I'd say it was pretty hard. It was really more when I actually left high school, like it was that a couple of major traumas happened. So up until about 19, I was going along pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So do you go to college right away?
Yes, it's a little bit different to the States here. So we have we call it high school after primary school. So you do 6 years of high school. In those days when I was growing up, you might just do 4 years of high school and then leave to get a job, or go to technical college, or you go to the last 2 years of senior high school. You come up like 17, 18. I was like 18, 19. And then, so following high school, yeah, I went to university in the capital of Australia called Canberra, but that didn't go too well.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that at all, or?
Yeah, well, I went to Australian National University. I was enrolled. Mum and dad were paying for it all. I was enrolled in a college there, like a dorm, like I was living in the dormitory of a Catholic St. John's College. I'd enrolled in English literature, medieval literature, philosophy, and German. One of my regrets is I didn't stick with the language, because anyway, all the social scene. There was one particular young woman I was going out with a little bit, and we kind of like had a night together one night where I said some pretty cruel things to her, and it was just before, and then we had what was called the Easter break, so I went home to see mum and dad, and when I came back, had all these people come and run up to me and said, "Andrew, where have you been? Like we thought you may have been in the car with them." So this young woman who had died in a car crash, she was in the car on her own, and it went into a tree, and
Oh no.
she was clinically depressed. I'm pretty sure she was.
Do you
And
think it was purposeful?
I think it was purposeful. I went to the funeral and said a few words at the funeral, and it was a hugely emotional time in my life. And so then I couldn't keep going. I dropped out of university at that point, and was in a very vulnerable place, and came back to live with mum and dad at Wollongong. I got a little flat near the beach, but I was sort of going out with this kind of sweetheart from high school, but then I met an older woman, 5 years older than myself, who had 2 children, and she had her own mental health issues, which I wasn't aware of at the time. And eventually, over a period of time, I moved in with her and she had two little children, so I bonded with the children and with her, and it was a very a kind of should I stay, should I go situation. But eventually I married her when I was about 22 years old, and then went back to university in Wollongong. Yeah.
I meant to ask you earlier, you said your dad was had some mental health challenges. Do you think he was haunted by the war at all? Do you think that was a factor?
Yes, my guess would be it probably dated back to the traumatic events that he would have gone through in the war, and the mental health issue manifested in certain behaviors, which I won't go into, but like they were quite shaming to hear about, and it would have been really hard for my mother and my sister and for me. And but my dad was a very loving and gentle man, but he had this other symptom that came out in this behavior, which was pretty shocking, and yeah, it was a formative time in my life as well.
At what point did you settle on a career in mental health, helping people?
Yeah, so that's, as you can understand, given my father's issues and the fact that I had a grandfather who was put into a lunatic asylum, they were kind of like in the background. I think if social work or psychotherapy had been available at the university I went to, I may well have gone down that track when I was 22, but that wasn't available. So my first degree was kind of like initially in like philosophy, sociology, yeah, really interested in all of that. And
humanities in general.
then I got there was a young charismatic sociology lecturer who recruited me to the Communist Party of Australia. He was a strong Marxist, so as a young man, I sort of got into Marxism for a little bit, and started to work with the local trade union movement a little bit, and so that had a bit of an influence on my life. And it was, I guess, an identification with working class England and Labour Party and so on.
Yeah, and then so was it later in life when you became a therapist?
Yeah, so the mental health question. So first degree wasn't in mental health. First marriage was very difficult. Ended up with about 15 years. So I was about 34, 35 when I eventually separated from my first wife. And at that time, I'd been working in what we call here the federal government and the state government. I've been working in industrial relations, and there was one particular moment in time when Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and we had this kind of trying to get industrial democracy embedded in Australian industries. It was quite interesting, and I was involved in that, but like all of these kind of things, it didn't last very long. And so I left my job in the public service and decided to study law back at Wollongong University. I thought maybe I could maybe specialize in industrial law, but I kind of like a couple of factors. One, I realized that I really wasn't, my calling really wasn't to be a barrister or an advocate. And I remember studying family law and going through my own family crisis and interviewing the family court counsellor and being much more attracted to the notion of being a counsellor than a barrister. So I switched from law to social work and went to do social work at Sydney University. And at Sydney University, doing social work, came across family therapy. And from studying family therapy, I got interested in a local therapist called Michael White, who developed what was called narrative therapy, which he developed with a guy called David Epstein in New Zealand. So it was kind of like an Australian New Zealand model of doing therapy, which became quite popular in the United States as well. I went down to a city called Adelaide in South Australia and studied narrative therapy, and that was my first embarking on my career as a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
My first job was to help another guy write a manual on stopping violence. So we were working with stopping violence groups with men who had domestic violence issues, and so that was my first entry into social work, and that lasted for a year. Then I got a job in child and adolescent mental health. That wasn't planned because when I was doing social work, I'd already got interested in Buddhism. So I was actually thinking about doing palliative care. I thought maybe I could do palliative care, but I never ended up doing palliative care. I ended up working in child and adolescent mental health.
Mm-hmm. Has that been your primary focus of your
That
practice?
was my primary focus for quite a while. And then I switched to adult mental health, and then just in private practice now, I don't work with adolescents or children anymore, and I only work with adults.
At what point did you gain an interest in meditation or Eastern philosophy or anything of that sort?
I remember growing up in high school. So I would say in those senior years of high school, one of the things I regret was I kind of like dropped out of maths and science because I found them boring. And that's always been missing a little bit in my education. But the way in which they were taught was kind of like I'd just be writing poetry or reading novels. Like I couldn't. So I was very drawn to literature, and probably the novels that really hit home the most for me were the ones by Hermann Hesse.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember one of my friends gave me a book on Buddhism, What the Buddha Taught, by Walpole or Rahula, and reading that and finding that interesting. But of course, reading Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and then I remember listening to one of your podcasts where you were talking about Star Wars. So it wasn't Star Wars for me, but the in the 70s growing up, it was Kung Fu, and that used to come on the TV on Saturday nights. So. Like I graduated high school in 75, dropped out of university in 76. So like I remember watching Kung Fu in 1976. And of course, we'd done the usual things. We'd read Alan Watts and books about LSD and float tanks and Carlos Castaneda with my friends and all that kind of stuff. So that was all in the background.
The Carlos Castaneda era was college or high school?
High school, yeah. Mm-hmm. Along with psychedelics and all that kind of stuff.
So you tried psychedelics?
Yeah. There's plenty of mushrooms around where I grew up. So
you guys just go pick them?
We had a bountiful supply.
Do you think that influenced your interest in mysticism or spirituality or anything?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of natural, like I remember like a couple of peak experiences when I was younger, but like not too dramatic. I remember once in high school in England, first year, a moment where we were in the music class and we were listening to Holt's the planets, and the music teacher played Jupiter, and they just transported me somewhere else. It was just an amazing experience, and then like a few like natural sort of peak experiences, not overly dramatic, but the taking the mushrooms and the LSD in high school were fairly dramatic, and certainly trying to make sense out of all of that was probably one of the paths leading to Zen. But I didn't start sitting Zazen until I was going through the marital crisis. My son was born.
With your first wife?
Two stepsons and then my first birth son, and my only child through birth. And I was reading, done the usual thing, reading The Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau. I also read Joko Beck's book, which really struck home.
Every day.
Joko the book was kind of like the one I carried around most of all through the crisis was Joko. And So after my son was born, and I thought I've got to try and we'd separated before my son was born, but then we got back together again. So I thought I've got to try and do my best to be a good dad and try and make this marriage work. And so I started sitting zazen,
Mm-hmm.
and the closest there was the Sydney Zen Centre was the first Zen centre established in Australia. So sometimes I go to the Sydney Zen Centre.
What lineage is that?
And then there was this other group that started a little bit closer to where I lived, where I used to go along to as well. Sorry?
What lineage was the Sydney Zen Center?
The Sydney Zen Centre was a group of people who had been meditating for a while, and finally they were able to get in touch with Robert Aiken. So Robert Aiken would come to Australia. So he was the first kind of... So the Sydney Zen Centre became the Diamond Sangha in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
But there was another guy who said there was another little group, a sitting group, with a guy who was studying with Joko that I used to go along to as well.
Mm-hmm. And which of the two types of Zen kind of felt more home to you, or did it seem different?
It didn't seem that much different at that time, other than listening to we listened to recorded Dharma talks by Joko, and I remember going. There was a guy called Jeff Dawson, who's an Ordinary Mind teacher in Sydney, and I started to work on Mu with him, but we didn't go very far. I also remember attending my first Zen weekend retreat with a guy called Father Amasami. Many years, one of my first Zen retreats, and he was a Jesuit priest who still has an ashram in India, I assume,
Mm-hmm.
who was in the Diamond Sangha. But I never connected, and never sort of had a connection with the teacher over a long period of time, and Mu didn't land at that point in time. Mm-hmm. And basically I kind of like also experimented with. There's another a beautiful meditation center, insight meditation center in the Blue Mountains in the hinterland of Sydney, which is kind of like similar to your Massachusetts Insight Center. So it was a Burmese teachers, but also Western teachers, and had some lovely experiences there on 10-day retreats doing the Burmese style, Mahasi style meditation, and that became a little bit more predominant than Zen for a while. And after my first marriage ended, I was studying social work. I was very almost toing and froing about going to a monastery in Burma to become a monk.
When you were doing that type of insight meditation, do you feel you kind of gotten at these retreats? Would you kind of get into deep samadhi, or is it more like open awareness, or what?
Yeah, it was more deep samadhi through the concentration practice, which I don't do anymore. But it was the concentration practice.
What were the instructions?
You just come back to the rising and falling of the breath, back to the abdomen, mm-hmm. and then just through the absolute repetition of the 1 hour sitting, the 1 hour walking, the 1 hour sitting, the 1 hour walking. And then eventually you just start to sit through the walking periods. I remember one stage where I just sat, I don't know, for about 5 hours nonstop or something. Where you go through the pain barriers, which is a bit risky, but like it felt okay. The pain was very intense, but then the pain would break up into pleasurable experiences, and you go into more minute details, and eventually you had that feeling of your legs just going into the ground like the roots of a tree, and that sense of non-separation in that way. Mm-hmm. And I remember having some lovely, like, big up heart pourings of compassion for like an insect I saw that was being sort of eaten, and that kind of thing. So I was quite drawn to it, but it's a very monastic practice, and so it draws you into that sort of monastic kind of headset. And at the time, I just met the woman who was going to become my second wife, and we had a couple of arguments over this toing and froing about me going to the monastery. So I eventually gave up the idea of going to the monastery and decided to stay with the woman who became my second wife, Annie.
Looking back at that style of practice, do you feel you got anything from it? Like, is there an aspect of your practice now that you feel has been influenced or helped by that style of practice?
Good question. I think at the time it was helpful for me. I think it was more in the sense in which because it was kind of like a crisis time in my life, and I think it was kind of like a refuge,
Mm-hmm.
providing me with a deep sense of a deep sense of present moment experience, and a sense of a life direction,
Mm-hmm.
calling. But I think even then I was thinking this is just a little bit too removed from everyday life for me, and
You think you're using it as escapism a little bit?
possibly,
Yeah.
possibly, yeah.
Yeah. Because that deep, concentrated practice can be quite pleasant, actually.
It could be very pleasant experiences as well. Yeah, it could be
Yeah.
very, very, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. They There's
Yeah,
this
go
one
on.
monk who could pretty regularly go into like the four jhana states, and they hooked him up with the fMRI stuff, and
Yeah,
turned out it was the opioid receptors in the brain that were firing off when he's having these deep samadhi states. So I mean, it's literally like it's like an opioid experience.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
But I remember them. One of the things I remember is the Burmese monks. They were
Mhm.
saying, there was like lovely trees and birds, and say, don't look at the birds. Don't look at the. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there was a sense of not. There was almost like a message not to enjoy the sensual experiences.
Mhm. What is the student teacher relationship like in that style practice back then, or
It
now?
was it was it was it was just like on the context of the retreat. You would just go and do the interview with the teacher, and it was just telling you what you're doing and focusing on the abdomen, blah blah blah. There was no attempt to. As a Burmese monk, so there was no attempt to explore your your relationships or anything like that. It was simply what's the technique you're using. Yeah.
Like when you would have these like outpouring of compassion and big emotions would you bring those experiences to the teacher, or do you just kind of keep those to yourself?
I can't remember now. I may have done. He may have smiled or something, but honestly, I can't remember.
Yeah.
The relationship with the one thing I do remember is not so much there wasn't a sense of much of a relationship with the teacher, to tell you the truth. It
Hmm.
was more of a sense of the atmosphere of the place and the chanting of the Pali in the evening or something like that. I mean, the Pali language, the way they would chant it was quite magical. And
Hmm.
I remember more of that kind of feeling.
Was it kind of sing-songy and musical?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So what was kind of next on your practice journey?
Um, I do remember there was a retreat with the Sydney Zen Centre, and I can't, I lose sort of chronological order, but there was one retreat where I had a kind of little opening experience, which I'd had once before on as an adolescent at high school
Mhm.
on amphetamine, and it was kind of like this was just with the usual the kind of there was the fly buzzing and doing zazen facing the wall, and then all of a sudden I was just the buzzing of the fly, and everything else had gone, and that
Mhm.
sense of the absolute collapse of any boundary of separate, there's no boundary at all, and that was pretty amazing. But like it wasn't like a huge dramatic thing like
Mhm.
Henry was describing, in Henry Shukman, your interview with him and his
Mhm.
book on Blade of Grass, and nothing dramatic like that, but it was still a kind of, wow, what was that kind of experience? And
Do you take
uh,
it to your teacher? to the
I
teacher?
didn't really have a teacher at that time, and I don't remember sort of. Yeah, it just never happened, and it wasn't until I kept. I mean, I used to go to the when I was in Adelaide doing I used to go to the Adelaide Zen Centre, which was a Diamond Sangha centre, and went with a few sessions with them, but never connected to the teacher. And It was only really when we left Adelaide and we moved to a place in northern Queensland, which is a tropical area in Australia, and we lived there for a year, and it was a beautiful environment, but very hot and humid, but not much Buddhism around, not much culture around. But that's when I read Barry's book, his first book, Ordinary Mind and Psychoanalysis, the common ground between Zen and psychoanalysis. And I read his book. So
That came out in the 90s, right?
that would have been
Oh no, that was more like 2003,
that was
4.
when we moved from. See, after I did narrative therapy, I did psychoanalytical training in Adelaide. So that was two. So we moved to about 2002. So it was about 2002 that I read that book, and so I sent him an email, and he replied like a few hours later, and it was a very very generous, open, encouraging response that I received from him. And so we started up an email correspondence, and it was quite amazing that he was able to hold me and teach me and have a sense of a deep relationship, primarily initially just through emails. Like, it was just the way in which he would write to me, which was really connected me with him.
How through all of this different kind of trying different Zen groups and different types of Buddhism, were you maintaining a daily sitting practice pretty well, or was it pretty sporadic?
Yeah, no, the influence of Joko, I think. I mean, I never actually met Joko. I talked to her once on the phone, but I never met her. She did come to Australia for a few years in Brisbane, and there's a teacher in Brisbane who was Joko's student. But she did emphasize sitting every day, and so I did my best to sit every day as much as I could. I mean, there would have been some days that I missed, but that was probably my main practice, to try and sit every day. And if I was to characterize the whole history of my involvement with Buddhism and Zen, I'd say trying to sit every day and practice, have the sense of bringing this into everyday life, has been the most consistent. Whereas I would say that in terms of actual sitting hours, in terms of like doing retreats or sessions, I'd be down the bottom. So like sessions and retreats have never been a big thing in my life.
Interesting. At any point did your and Barry's relationship switch from email to calls or Skype or Zoom or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's I would visit every now and again. Every few years I'd go to New York and do a session with him, and sometimes we'd then when Zoom became, we didn't do too much telephone. I think we did. So we started doing some Zoom calls at some point. I can't remember exactly when they started. But sometimes the emails were always continuous and still are. But like and every now and again we start doing some Zoom calls. Yeah, and we do that for a while. And it became very clear very quickly that I regarded him as my teacher. And so that when we moved I was living in New Zealand for 3 years, and that was the first time I visited Barry. I was in New Zealand, and So we went from northern Queensland to New Zealand for 3 years. I did my PhD in New Zealand. And then when I finished my PhD back in Australia, when we came back to Australia, we moved to Bellingen, that little town I was talking about. So when I settled in Bellingen, that was about 2006, I did start doing some koan work with a diamond sangha teacher, Roshi, called Sexton Burke, who lived on a commune in Bellingen. And Sexton was a student of Subhana Roshi, and he had started the Zen group in Bellingen, which kind of like morphed into an insight group because the formalized sort of formal practice of Zen didn't quite fit the culture over here, whereas the insight's a lot more informal. And but when I met him, when I first came to Bellingen, I actually got in. I did a session with Jeff Dawson, who was the Sydney teacher. But I asked Jeff if he knew anybody in Bellingen, and there was a guy called Vince, and Vince was from San Diego. Vince had sat with Joko for many years before he met an Australian when we came to Australia. And Vince is now a teacher as well in the Ordinary Mind. And that's like, so me and Vince started sitting together in Bellingen and sit on a regular basis together. He was really good, Vince Jensen, and very supportive of each other's practice, just the two of us. Then I found out about Sexton, and Sexton had been diagnosed with bowel cancer, so he wasn't at the best of his fitness. But me and Vince, together with Sexton, started a Zen group going again, and Sexton started giving Tay shows, and we recorded some of those Tay shows. And I worked with him on koans, and unfortunately he died much too young. And can't remember the year he died now. It was 2010, or I can't remember. But so while Barry was aware I was working. That was one of the nice things about Barry too. He was kind of like, he was not like exclusive. He was quite inclusive. So that was fine with him for me to work with Sexton. I continued working with Barry, and when Sexton died, I continued working with. He passed the baton to another Diamond Sangha teacher called Ellen Davison, who lives in Lismore, which is a little bit further north. And she used to come down and do one-day sessions and that kind of thing. And so we kept the Zen group going, and we were doing sessions in that Zen group. And then around about 2014, we started to discuss, me and Barry decided to discuss giving me transmission, the first level of transmission. But it was a little bit too relationally complicated for me to stay in that particular Zen group. So I then formed my own Zen group.
So the koan teachers, you start with Mu with them?
Yeah, so I work with Sexton. So we started on Mu, and that quickly changed to who is hearing. And that was kind of like my favorite sort of koan. I think maybe Sexton passed me too quickly on that one. I don't know, but like it wasn't like a dramatic thing. So we then worked through the post. You do your breakthrough koan, and then you have a little booklet of little
miscellaneous
koans, and you work through those, like the sound of a temple bell kind of thing, and all those ones. And they were fun. Like, I mean, we used to meet in the mornings, and I just remember Sexton, and always like it was a very playful, enjoyable kind of thing. I enjoyed it. It was playful, and then I started, after Sexton departed, working with Ellen. I continued, I think it was going through the Blue Cliff record, but I don't know, there was something about it. I think it was started to become a little bit too conceptual and too intellectual at some point, and I take full responsibility for that. I'm not, so I kind of like lost interest. Yeah.
So in what way would you work with Barry? Would you bring incidents from your life and kind of break that down, and where's the self, where's the, like what was your mechanism of working with Barry? And did that change throughout your practice with him?
If I was to describe with Barry, it was very hard to distinguish, and I probably wouldn't necessarily distinguish Zen practice from psychotherapy practice. It was kind of like, all the self doubts that are coming up in your life that you'd take to psychotherapy, you'd take to Barry as well, in terms of the Zen teaching, and he was very much focused on the non-separation from the barriers within, the places you didn't want to go to within. So it was more about having that breakthrough into that sense of I'm okay. It was more about that sense of being okay to be me, and the continuing, the ways in which various things would disrupt that process. And so I would say, just to sort of generalize it, the little T traumas that would continue to disrupt that sense of being okay, to be me. And he would work with that in a way, like, as you know, Barry's primary psychotherapy teacher was Heinz Kohut, and so he was primarily concerned with empathy. So if I ever got lost, Barry would also just come back to the empathy, like, just being understanding of people. So he would do his best he would bring that sense of understanding to me. And I mean, I'd done some analysis, like a psychotherapy. It wasn't a class, like it was a once a week psychotherapy with an analyst in Adelaide that I'd found extremely beneficial.
You had or had not?
Eh?
Did you say you had or had not found it beneficial?
Yeah, beneficial in Adelaide. Yeah, it was like a very nice kind of fatherly transference. I think there's some aspect of a fatherly transference with Barry, but he's a few years older than me, not a lot of years older than me. There's a certain amount of twin, like in self psychology they call it twinship. It was really lovely having someone like Barry to work with. I mean, he used to always say my ideal Zen student would be someone who's fluent in classical Greek and Wittgenstein. Like, I'm never going to be that. I'm never going to be fluent in classical Greek or Wittgenstein, but I mean, I had a kind of a dilettante interest in philosophy, and of course Barry's widely read in literature as well. He loves his poetry, so it was a nice fit. And so I had that kind of intellectual fit, and it had the emotional fit, I would describe it more as the way in which he held and encouraged me, and always I would just come up with questions, and he would respond to my questions, and in a way which was really encouraging and motivating.
To be devil's advocate a little bit, and maybe this is to kind of tease out the difference between Zen and maybe psychotherapy. Is there any danger of working towards being okay with the self, where you're kind of reifying the self and like stabilizing the narrative of the self, or do you feel it's kind of undoing that narrative and letting go of preconceptions of self? Like where does that?
Yeah, no, man. Barry would be aghast if he thought it was reifying.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a sense in which and still now, I would suggest that we have to be careful to distinguish between what you call the process of self-referencing, or the sort of the sense of a self-identity clinging to our original nature, or dharma, kaya, whatever you want to call it. But like but there's a sense in which I think the what I call the relational self, the self which has needs. And I think we have to respect the relative reality of the self in that regard, because it's also the same way in which I'd say the same way in which the body has needs, which we have to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
The relational self has needs which we have to take care of. If we don't take care of the body and the relational self, then all the rest is not going to work. So it's real to that extent, and not an illusion. To me, the illusion part is the seeing through the what we call the separate self, or the ego self, or whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's kind of like a mistake to make, to kind of like dismiss the importance of the self. I think we have to look after it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's I don't know if material is the right word, but a dynamic difference or process difference between your psychotherapy patients and your Zen students? Like, are you guys working towards the same end, or is there a different gear, so to speak, for the Zen students where they're approaching it from a different way? Or do you think it's working towards the same end with maybe just different methodologies?
Yeah. I took some, like for Barry, like he would often have a double relationship as a Zen teacher and a psychotherapist with his client students.
Mm-hmm.
That's happened for me as well, and I found that very beneficial. On the other hand, there'll be a number of clients that I see in psychotherapy that got nothing to do with their Zen practice or my Zen practice is always there in the psychotherapy, but I have a variety of people I see in psychotherapy, and so for some of those clients, it's really doing our best to help them recover from fairly traumatic circumstances in their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you can introduce, and a lot of not just psychoanalysis, but a lot of contemporary therapies bring in notions of self with a capital S, if you like, or awareness with a capital A, or that you can actually introduce to people who are seeing you for trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so there has been a convergencing of not just psychoanalysis, but Western psychotherapy in general, with what we might call touching on non-dual stuff in trauma-related fields as well. So apart from the kind of popular, I'm not trained in EMDR therapy, but like, for example, and I'm not trained in internal family systems therapy, but I'm aware of it. But like, internal family systems therapy very much draws upon this notion of a self that can never be damaged, that was never traumatized, and in there's a guy called Richard Miller in the United States who developed I Rest Yoga Nidra, who works with veterans in the USA, which draws upon similar notions. So not everybody's going to be necessarily drawn towards that, but it can be there in the background of the therapy. It might just be building up your inner resources in terms of dealing with the trauma, and you might not get drawn into that sort of more other non-dimension in terms of the self, or you might, I don't know. But communicating a sense in which actually there's something here that was never damaged, I think can be very helpful for people, because often the message that people got was, you're damaged. And
so for your students that are Zen practitioners, what do you think Zazen itself adds to the dynamic? to the process.
With clients who are Zen practitioners as well.
Mhm.
What is that? Yeah, look, I think initially it would have been that sense of lots of things, really. Starting with that notion of Joko's ABC, building a bigger container,
Mhm.
which fits with the window of tolerance idea in trauma treatment. So
Mhm.
if you have a very small window of tolerance, you have to titrate it very slowly. The bigger your you're wanting to make that window bigger and bigger, so that you can be with more intense effects, and eventually maybe that window becomes limitless.
Mhm.
Yeah. So OzZen builds capacity to be with this moment, whatever this moment, rather than trying to escape from the moment. Yeah.
Mhm.
The only difference would be that we do less. I've done a lot of thinking around this as to, when I was younger, I was really into, really going for it, doing really long retreats, sitting long hours. But because my sangha is often, there'd be probably the majority of people will be over 50. There's a few under 50. And I think that's the case in the United States as well. I think there's a whole thing about they're talking about the Great Death, the boom of the
Right.
baby boomers dying off, right? And so the challenge is always how to bring younger people in,
Mhm.
and I think that's why the non-dual movement's been so successful. I'm not quite sure how you put the numbers on that. I'm not quite sure. But I think we have to get, in a sense, smarter around how we teach this. I don't think it's necessary to sit long hours all the time. I think we can get smarter at how we actually bring this practice into our everyday lives.
Mhm.
And so how do we do that? I think it's a question worth talking about.
Mhm.
The sense of not getting, like in yoga, don't get it's not about the posture, and the same with Zen. It's not just about the posture. It's not about the posture. The posture is actually wherever you are, there it is. So getting away from this kind of obsession about the posture all the time, I think is important.
Mhm. So when Barry first broached the subject of becoming a teacher in Dharma transmission for you, how did you feel about that? Did that seem a natural transition, being that you're already a therapist and kind of in a healing modality, or were you reluctant, or did it just seem like, yeah, sure, that makes sense?
Yeah, I was already in a leadership role, so it made sense to me.
Mhm.
But when it actually happened, it was very daunting. So I know you've talked before, like for me, as a working class kid from Manchester, I've always had some of that cultural baggage, and so that the whole imposter syndrome stuff
Mhm.
and the anxiety around it would come up. So in some ways, becoming it's a cliche, but when you start to teach something, you really start to learn it. So it's kind of like it's just a deepening of you being a student, really, to become a teacher.
Mhm.
That's how I
Um,
see it.
and you did Denkai first, right? The way Barry
Yeah,
does it,
yeah.
you do Denkai, which is you receive the precepts, and then later Denbo, where you receive the Dharma. Is that correct?
Interesting. Like I hadn't the precepts. I don't know if you know this, but Joko stopped doing precepts, Jukai ceremony,
Mhm.
and the two ordinary mind teachers in Australia don't do precepts Jukai, as far as I know. That was something that Barry reintroduced into his sangha,
Mhm.
and so I hadn't actually done the Jukai. So when I received Denkai, it was kind of like a Jukai and Denkai together.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Did you study the
I
precepts formally
participated in one of
going into
his.
it?
I participated, like Barry has this kind of you do like precept study leading up to Jukai for about like a year, like a 10 months. And so when I was in the States, I sort of sat in the Jukai group and participated in that. And
Mhm.
I tossed I thought, I wasn't sure whether or not to introduce it. Anyway, I finally introduced it here as well. So
Mhm.
we do a similar thing here.
So you do Jukai.
Mm.
Mhm. You
Well,
guys sell your
the
own.
one thing I liked about the Jukai, it was the ceremony itself. I love, and I love the Jukai talks that the students would give. Very moving, and I thought, yeah, this is a good practice. And I see the Jukai. It's because we don't have a koan curriculum, because as you know, Joko dropped the koan curriculum.
Mhm.
Then in some ways, obviously, it doesn't. Well, I guess studying the precepts goes on for the rest of your lifetime, but like the actual formal study of the precepts is kind of like a nice,
It's like a curriculum.
yeah, it's a nice curriculum that students can get into, and then that sort of that transitioning, into the Jukai ceremony and all of that seems to work pretty well.
Mhm. Excuse me. So so Denkai with him, that was a public ceremony where you took the precepts
Yeah,
publicly?
the Denkai was a public ceremony in Garrison. Yeah, at the same time that Karen was receiving her Denbo. I think it was the same retreat.
Mhm. And did you sew your own rakusu, or were you presented with one? How did that work?
No, the Barry's group had somebody who would sew the rekasus and sell them. So I bought the rekasu. Yeah.
Mhm. And then a couple years ago you got Denmo, is that correct?
Yeah. So 2019. So that's when I went to the Zendo in New York for
Mhm.
3 months and stayed there, and as they sort of like the live-in manager for
Mhm.
the time I was there, and had the Dembo ceremony, and I had my son come over for the ceremony, and he brought a letter from my sangha and read the letter out at the ceremony.
Mhm. What,
Because I remember you talking to Henry about you know the issue of around how a teacher transmitting to another
mhm.
student, and what Barry used to always say was that Joker would say, like, it's the sangha that makes the teacher.
Mhm.
And so in our tradition, it's the sangha is what gives you teacherhood,
Mhm.
and so the ceremony is just a formalization of that process.
Mhm. And this was all public. There was not like the Soto thing where you go alone in a room at midnight.
Oh, we that was part of it as well. Yeah.
Oh, you guys did that too. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And
It was a
so now,
lovely evening, a lovely evening ceremony as well in the big hall at Garrison, where Barry loves making people do lots of bows. So at that point of time, my knee was just about still functioning well enough to do the bowing, but I had to stop sitting in. I used to sit in the Burmese posture when I was young. I never sat in the half lotus. I used to sit in the Burmese posture.
mhm.
But at a certain point, around about 2015 or something, yeah, my knee's no good. I was told I had to have a knee operation, but I never bothered. But I just stopped sitting in Burmese and started sitting in a chair, and my knee's been fine ever since.
I actually think I've damaged my knees from Burmese. I sat in Burmese for probably 2 decades, and I'm pretty sure I damaged my knees from that posture.
Yeah, I probably did as well. I know I had a little injury from playing soccer when I was 19. My knee went,
Mhm.
cartilage problem, and the Burmese probably finally, yeah. So I wasn't able to walk properly. So, but when I stopped sitting in the Burmese posture, I've been all right ever since. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, what was I going to ask? Oh
So
boy.
we did Denbo in New York, and
Oh,
yeah.
I remember. So, I know you have the weekly koan group with Barry. Keep in touch in a kind of a teacher student modality still, or is it kind of switch character your relationship?
No, it moved more to having, I guess, also, with Barry's limited time, and I'm very much aware of that. And as I said to you before, I mean, the one word that always comes up for me with Barry is generosity. He was such giving, and in terms of his time, would almost bring tears to my eyes. And so. I'm very happy just to participate in the keeping in touch with each other via teaching group, and we have been, primarily doing that through discussing various koan collections. But it doesn't have to be koan collections. It could be we could discuss a book on psychotherapy or something. So yeah.
Do you guys talk shop, with psychotherapy itself? Do you guys trade ideas and methodologies and so forth?
Occasionally, yeah. I mean, there's something I'm working on now, and I mean, I've always been, again, like a great admiration for Barry as to how he's able to do a full-time psychotherapy practice, teaches a Zen group every week, and find time to write those books. I don't know how he does it. So I struggle to, and I've been trying to write a book for years, but it's always a struggle for me to try and get something finished. So I might get something I'm working on in writing, and I'll send that to him, and he'll send me a few comments back and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Can you share the theme of the book you're writing, or do you want to keep that close to your vest at this point?
Something to do with there's a lot of themes running throughout it, but I guess basically it's how it continues the theme of Barry. It's kind of like but how we bring together the sense of evolution, like in terms of our attachment system and attachment-based love, and how attachment-based love can only take us so far. And how does attachment-based love fit with, what Henry calls original love, or the Dharmakaya, or original nature? And I like the word love being introduced into Zen practice, and that and the acknowledgement of the needs of the body and the relational self, while at the same time trying to see through the attachment to the self. And then I'm interested in how you bring together Yogacara into depth psychology. I got interested in Kashmir Shaivism as well through the teachings of Rupert Spira. So I'm kind of like, I'm interested in the consciousness. Just recently come across the work of Don Hoffman. So I would gravitate more towards what in traditional philosophy was called idealism, but I think it's realism as well. I think if everything is consciousness, then that's real as well. That's realism as well.
What do you think of Don Hoffman's thesis?
I've only starting to study him, but initially I'm very, very much drawn to those ideas.
Yeah, he's I'm not sure I can totally go all the way with him, but I feel 80% there is incredibly helpful to me. In the last 20% just maybe I'm not smart enough to understand it.
No, I can't go there with the mathematics side of it, but it's like everybody says, the ultimate reality is beyond definition by definition. But to me, the words like consciousness come closest to it in terms of capturing what it feels like to me anyway, as to what reality is.
I love his user interface metaphor. I think that
the interface, and like the interface,
such a wonderful way to approach talking about consciousness and awareness and perception and so forth. It's
it makes absolute sense for me.
Cool. So one last thing I wanted to touch on, and then we could talk about whatever you want if you want to spend a little bit more time. But I'm curious, as a teacher, Zen, we're very big about our lineage, keeping our lineages going. So what would you look for in a student to bring them into the lineage? Give them transmission. What qualities would you want in someone's practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. And look, and one of the interesting things about becoming a teacher, which was I didn't predict, I had no idea about this actually, but um, building a sangha was challenging because it was something in my personal life. I'd always avoided managerial positions, leadership positions in that sense. Always was more drawn to that sort of solo practice, So but I think I'm pretty good at building sangha and working in that kind of leadership position and help bringing people together as best as I can and encouraging people. And actually, I enjoy it. It was a part. I mean, one of the things that when you become a Zen teacher, it quickly dissolves the romanticism around the idea of being a Zen teacher, because it's a lot of fucking hard work, right? And I put a lot of hours into it that are unpaid, and but I enjoy it, and it always is reciprocal, whenever you're giving, you're receiving in a way. And so that dimension is ongoingly interesting and fascinating as to how you actually build a sangha. And when it comes to, well, the first quality that someone has to have is consistency, stability, and getting to that point. They talk I was listening to William Waldron talking with Polly. I forget Polly's last name, but William Waldron's a Yogacara expert in the States, and those various levels or stages you go through, and you get to this various stages where you can backslide, but there's a certain stage you get to where you don't backslide. So it's something to do with that, getting to that. I don't know whether you call it a stage or not, but some sense of maturity where you have this, that that person's not going to backslide, that their commitment's absolutely going to be there for the rest of their lives. So, I mean, you can never be sure of that. I mean, things can happen, but you have a sense of that person is reliable. I think that's probably more important than anything else, actually. And then the sense of their ability to give, their ability to give, commitment and giving.
Great. Well, that's all the things I wanted to cover. Do you have any other topics you'd like to discuss, or?
No, Barry, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me onto your show. There's lots of luminaries on this show that I'm just a small minnow in there, but I think you're doing a wonderful job. I think I enjoy how you contextualize autobiographically various teachers' lives. I think that's really important.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.